Right at my mother's funeral. I had to stand there and watch my sister holding the child who never should have existed, while the man who once slipped an engagement ring onto my finger stood beside her like some perfect husband. I listened to them talk about family, fate, and how everything happens for a reason, while my whole body went numb. But the thing that made my sister go still wasn't the fact that I came back after all those years. It was when she saw the man who came with me. My name is Amanda Brooks. I'm 38 in the present day. I used to live in Boston and worked in luxury brand marketing. I used to be the kind of woman who believed in a few basic things. Work hard, love honestly, keep your family close, and in the end, things will be okay. I was engaged to Aiden Murphy, a wealthy, polished businessman everyone seemed to like. I thought I was lucky. Then my mother got sick. The wedding was getting close. My family needed me to be softer, more forgiving, more willing to give things up. And during the exact stretch of time when I was trying to be a good daughter, a good fiancé, and a good sister, the two people I trusted most betrayed me in the cruelest way possible. It wasn't just cheating. It wasn't just lying. They turned me into an outsider inside my own family. I used to think I was the kind of woman who knew how to build a solid life. I had a good job in Boston, a sunlit apartment, a full but organized schedule, and a man people kept telling me I was lucky to be marrying. From the outside, my life looked almost perfect. I worked in marketing for a high-end brand, and I was used to reading people, spotting tiny signals other people missed. The irony was that I could find weakness in a $1 million campaign in 10 minutes, but I couldn't see the cracks running right under my own feet. My name is Amanda Brooks. When all of this started, I was 33, engaged to Aiden Murphy, and convinced I was stepping into the most stable chapter of my life. Aiden was the kind of man who made people breathe a little slower when he walked into a room. He didn't talk much, but every word landed at the right time. He knew when to stay quiet, when to place a light hand on the small of my back, and exactly how to smile so people would think he was both kind and trustworthy. My parents loved him almost right away. My mother called him a rare kind of decent man, and I loved the peace I felt around him. Back then, my life was divided into clean sections. During the day, I worked at the agency. At night, I came home, reviewed wedding plans, answered emails from the planner, picked flower colors, sampled cakes, fixed the guest list, and stopped by the hospital when my mother had tests. Her health started getting worse at exactly the time I should have been thinking only about my wedding dress and honeymoon. She wasn't at her weakest yet, but everyone in the family knew something was slipping out of our control. We still laughed. We still had dinner together. We still talked about my wedding. But under all of that was a quiet fear no one said out loud. Out of everyone who moved in and out of my parents' house during that time, Tiffany was always the one who pulled attention the fastest. Tiffany is my older sister. She's 3 years older than me, beautiful in a way that makes people take a second look, and she has this almost instinctive gift for pulling every room toward herself. Ever since we were kids, she had a way of turning someone else's birthday into her stage. If I got praised for school, Tiffany would talk about some man who had just taken her to the most expensive restaurant in town. If I brought home good news, she always found a way to slide in with her own news, bigger, brighter, more interesting. Even so, I still believe that family, no matter how competitive, would never really push each other off a cliff. I remember very clearly the first dinner Aiden had at my parents' house as my official fiancé. My mother made her best lasagna. My father opened a bottle of wine he'd been saving since Christmas. I spent the whole afternoon picking out a dress because I wanted everything to feel natural, but still special. Aiden arrived right on time, brought flowers for my mother, shook my father's hand with the exact right amount of respect, then turned and kissed my cheek like he understood exactly what small gesture would warm up the whole kitchen. Tiffany arrived almost 40 minutes late. She walked in like she was stepping onto a photo set, hair softly curled, lipstick darker than usual, coat hanging off one shoulder just right. She apologized in that long-drawn voice of hers, said she'd been stuck at an appointment, then let her eyes rest on Aiden a little longer than they needed to. Just one beat, but I noticed. Aiden stood to greet her, as polite as always. Tiffany smiled in that way I had known since childhood. The way she smiled when she was measuring something, weighing something, deciding whether she wanted to win. Nothing happened during that dinner that would have looked strange to anyone but me. Tiffany asked Aiden about the investment fund he worked with. Aiden asked her about a gallery event she'd just attended. They teased each other lightly, just enough to make the room feel fun. My father liked that. My mother looked relieved that the two of them got along so easily. I sat there moving my fork around my pasta, telling myself I was imagining things. I had grown up with Tiffany. I knew the difference between a harmless look and a look that was casting a hook. After that dinner, Tiffany started sliding herself deeper into the wedding planning. She offered to help with flowers, sent me wedding dress links, said she'd help plan the bridal shower. From the outside, it looked like support. I still wanted to believe I was just exhausted. The problem was that Tiffany never helped quietly. She helped in a way that shifted every room slightly off me and toward her. At the flower appointment, she talked to the florist more than I did. At the cake tasting, she turned the whole thing into a playful performance, and everybody watched for her reaction. At events like those, Aiden would sometimes show up for a while before leaving for work. But whenever he was there, Tiffany seemed to glow a shade brighter, and Aiden seemed just a little too patient in the way polite men are when an attractive woman gives them attention. I hated that I noticed it. I hated the feeling that I was thinking badly of my own sister. So I kept swallowing the feeling, folding it neatly into a corner, and moving forward as if everything was normal. During that stretch, work was brutal. I was running a big campaign by day, handling wedding details at night, and going to the hospital whenever my mother got worse. I was barely sleeping, living on coffee, telling myself that if I could just be a little softer, a little more generous, everything would calm down. The first real sign that made me stop came on a Thursday afternoon. My car was in the shop, so I borrowed Aiden's to pick up some wedding invitation samples. When I bent down to grab a folder from the passenger side floor, I found a small gold earring tucked near the seat. It wasn't mine. I didn't wear earrings like that, and I wasn't the type to lose jewelry in a car. I held it in my palm for a few seconds too long, staring at the tiny stone catching the light. Then I sat there in the closed car, hands cold, and my mind ran in a ridiculous direction. Maybe it belonged to a coworker, maybe his assistant, maybe a client. I had already invented 3 explanations for him before I could admit that the 4th one was the only reason my hands were shaking. That night, I handed the earring to Aiden. I just set it beside his water glass and asked casually where it came from. He looked at it for less than 2 seconds, frowned like he was trying to remember something unimportant, and said it might be Megan's, his assistant's, because the team had carpooled from a meeting the week before. His answer was so smooth it was hard to catch. Then he asked why I looked so tired and moved his chair closer to mine like the real problem was that I hadn't been sleeping enough. I nodded, smiled, and hated myself for feeling relieved. A few days later, I caught a strange perfume scent on the scarf he had left on the couch. It was expensive, warm, with a sandalwood base note. Not mine. I stood in the living room holding that scarf, and the feeling came back. No longer a passing thought, but a wire pulled tight in my chest. When Aiden walked out of the bathroom, I joked that someone had smelled really good around him lately. He laughed, kissed my forehead, said it probably came from some crowded event, then smoothly changed the subject to the market. His calmness made it even harder to trust my own instincts. I even tried hinting to Tiffany once. We were at a coffee shop near Back Bay, talking about the guest list for the bridal shower. I watched her stir her cappuccino and carefully said that Aiden had felt a little off lately, like there was something he wasn't telling me. Tiffany didn't look up right away. She stirred one more circle, then smiled lightly and said every bride starts seeing ghosts before the wedding because stress makes them lose sleep. She told me not to ruin a good thing just because I was overloaded. It sounded reasonable, but there was something in her tone that bothered me. It didn't sound like a sister calming me down. It sounded like someone putting a lid back on a box I had just touched. That same night, I went to the hospital after work because my mother had to do more testing. I sat by her bed and adjusted her blanket while she asked about my dress and the guest list. I wanted to tell her the truth, that I was scared, but all I said was that I was tired. She stroked my hand and said, "Women sometimes create storms in their own heads when life is going well." I knew she didn't mean to hurt me, but the words still made me feel alone. About a week later, I called Aiden around 9 at night to ask if he'd be home for dinner. He didn't answer. 15 minutes later, he texted that he was in a meeting with partners in Cambridge and would be late. Not long after, I texted Tiffany because my mother wanted to know why she hadn't stopped by. Tiffany replied that she was having drinks with an old friend in Cambridge and would probably head home later. Normally, those two texts wouldn't have meant anything, but that night, some strange force made me keep staring at my phone. When Aiden got home close to midnight, I asked how the meeting had gone. He mentioned a small restaurant with live jazz and said a waiter had nearly spilled wine on a nearby table. The next morning, I called Tiffany to ask whether she could stop by the hospital that afternoon. She was blow-drying her hair and casually told me the place in Cambridge had been fun. There was a jazz band, and she'd been annoyed because a clumsy waiter had almost spilled wine on her bag. I stood there in my kitchen, holding a cold cup of coffee, my heart pounding like it was trying to break out of my ribs. Not because I had proof, but because for the first time, the two lies touched each other too perfectly. Nobody repeats the same tiny detail in the same way unless they were really in the same place. I set the cup down, stared out the apartment window, and understood that if I kept pretending everything was fine, there would come a day when I wouldn't trust my own eyes at all. I tried telling my parents that weekend. I chose a time when my mother was feeling slightly better, my father was reading the paper at the kitchen table, and Tiffany wasn't there. I spoke slowly, carefully, trying not to sound like I was making an accusation. I told them a few things felt off. I said maybe I was wrong, but my instincts had never screamed this loudly before. My father lowered the paper and looked at me with a mix of concern and irritation. My mother sighed first, like she had guessed I was about to say something that would make everything harder. My father told me to be careful before I blew things up while my mother was in this state. My mother said I was probably overwhelmed, that Aiden was a good man, and Tiffany could be careless, but not that careless. I sat there in my own family kitchen listening to the people who loved me most brush my fear aside for the sake of keeping the room calm. When I left, I almost decided to let it go a few more days. But the moment I stepped onto the front porch, I saw Tiffany's car parked down the street, and something cold ran down my spine. I just knew I had reached the point where I couldn't keep rocking myself back to sleep. On Monday morning, I changed my meeting schedule, left work early, and drove straight to Aiden's office building without telling him. I told myself I just needed to see him there, working like normal, so I could go home and end this obsession. But when the elevator doors opened onto his floor, the hallway was darker than usual, the front desk nearly empty, and from the far end, through the frosted glass, I heard a woman's laugh so familiar that my hand tightened around my bag strap. It was Tiffany's voice, drifting out of Aiden's private office through a door that wasn't quite shut. I remember that hallway more clearly than a lot of happy memories in my life. The overhead lights were cold, hospital white. I walked toward Aiden's office with my heart pounding so hard my ears were ringing. The door was barely cracked open. I looked through that narrow gap and saw my sister sitting on the edge of my fiancé's desk, a glass of wine in one hand, the other resting lightly on his wrist in a gesture that looked practiced. Aiden was standing too close. Not social close, not accidentally close, the kind of close people stand only when they've stood there many times before. Tiffany said something I couldn't hear, and he laughed. It was the laugh I used to think was mine. I stood there for a few seconds, long enough to understand that what I was seeing wasn't one awkward moment. It was a whole world that had been running behind my back for a long time. I pushed the door open. They both turned. Tiffany slipped off the desk fast. Aiden straightened almost instantly. What hurt most wasn't the shock on their faces. It was the coordination. They reacted like people who had rehearsed this day together. I looked from one to the other and realized neither of them was truly stunned to be caught. They were just annoyed the timing didn't fit the script. "Amanda," Aiden said first, in that calm tone he always used when he wanted to lower the temperature in a room. "What are you doing here?" That question almost made me laugh. I asked what was strange about me coming to see my fiancé at his office during work hours. Tiffany jumped in right away, saying I had the wrong idea, that she had only stopped by to talk to Aiden privately about family stuff because our mother was getting worse. She spoke fast, smoothly. Aiden stepped toward me with both hands open, soothing. He said I was under too much stress, that I'd been overloaded for weeks, that this wasn't what it looked like. I looked at the wine glass in Tiffany's hand, the lipstick mark on the rim, her silk scarf tossed over the chair beside the liquor cabinet, Aiden's shirt unbuttoned lower than usual. No explanation they gave was strong enough to crush those details. But that's the horror of good gaslighting. It makes you doubt the evidence of your own eyes. I asked one question. How long have you two been sleeping together? Tiffany looked away. Aiden answered immediately and said they weren't. He said things between him and Tiffany may have been a little too close at times because my family was close, but I was taking it way too far. My sister started crying. She said I had been too stressed lately, that she had been trying to support me, and now I was standing there smearing her with sick, ugly assumptions. As I listened to her, I felt something in my chest break cleanly. Not because she had betrayed me. I had already felt that standing outside the door. What broke was the last illusion that if cornered, she would be ashamed enough to tell the truth. She wouldn't. She chose instead to push me into the role of the unstable woman losing control. I pulled out my phone, took 2 pictures, and left before my legs got too weak to hold me up. I don't remember much about the drive home. I only remember sitting in my garage for almost 10 minutes with the engine still running, both hands gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. One useless sentence kept circling in my head. Maybe there's still another explanation. That night, Aiden came home late. I had been sitting on the sofa for almost 2 hours with my phone in front of me, opening and closing those 2 pictures over and over. The second he saw my face, he stopped. I turned the screen toward him. No intro, no speech. Aiden looked at the pictures, then sat down across from me slowly, like a lawyer choosing his words. He said the photos didn't prove what I thought they proved. He brought up my mother again. Said Tiffany had been falling apart because she saw how busy I was and how distant I had become while my mother got worse. He added that she needed financial advice because she had private problems of her own. I listened to him, and every sentence was just believable enough that an outsider might hesitate. That's what makes good manipulators so dangerous. I asked why they needed wine in a closed office to talk about my mother. He said Tiffany had been emotional. I asked why her scarf was on the chair. He said she got warm. I asked why they had both mentioned the same jazz bar in Cambridge. He frowned, sighed, and changed direction. He said I was stitching unrelated details into a full-blown obsession. He told me I needed sleep, that I should pause the wedding planning for a few days, that I should look at my own stress instead of destroying everything we had built. When he said, "we," I nearly got sick. The next morning, Tiffany called before I even finished my first cup of coffee. She didn't apologize. She opened by saying my behavior the night before had been unacceptable. She said I had invaded her privacy, turned a difficult conversation into something filthy, and if I kept making things up like that, I was going to make our mother collapse. I stood there listening to her cold, sharp voice and realized their strategy was almost identical. They were not going to prove themselves innocent with truth. They were going to make me feel guilty for daring to point at the blood. The next 3 days felt like a fever. At night, I pulled bank statements, email confirmations, parking receipts, and synced calendars from an old iPad Aiden had forgotten to sign out of. I never imagined I would become the kind of woman sitting in her living room at 1 a.m. matching timestamps to restaurant bills. The evidence didn't appear dramatically, but it was cold enough to make me numb. A boutique hotel charge on a date Aiden had claimed he was at a conference. Dinner for 2 at a place Tiffany had posted from while tagging a fake location. Long late-night calls on evenings I had slept at the hospital with my mother. A jewelry receipt sent to Tiffany's address. I didn't have one perfect video to pin them to a wall with, but I had too much, and it all pointed one way. When I felt like I had enough, I called my parents and said I wanted everyone there Friday night. I didn't explain over the phone. I just said this involved me, Aiden, Tiffany, and I wasn't willing to hear one more sentence about dealing with it later. That evening, I arrived at my parents' house 10 minutes early. I brought a thick envelope and my laptop. Tiffany came in after me, wearing a cream knit dress, her makeup soft, looking so harmless it was almost insulting. Aiden walked in right behind her in a navy coat, hair neatly done, perfect as always. If anybody had looked through the window, they would have seen a decent family sitting down to clear up a misunderstanding before a wedding. Only I knew the room was about to break. I didn't circle the subject. I laid out printed photos, opened the laptop, pointed to each timestamp, each bill, each time they had been in the same place while telling different stories. I spoke slowly because if I talked too fast, I would cry, and I didn't want tears to make them think truth was weakness. My father looked through the papers, flipping them back and forth, lines deepening in his forehead. My mother started breathing faster the moment she saw the first photo with the 2 wine glasses in the office. Tiffany denied almost everything immediately. She said those transactions didn't prove a thing. Aiden kept his voice steady and said there were contexts I didn't understand, that yes, lines had become blurred between him and Tiffany at certain times, but they had never meant to hurt me. That sentence turned my blood cold, as if my pain were some unfortunate side effect, not the result of repeated choices made by 2 fully grown adults. I asked, in front of my parents, if nothing had happened, then why were there hotel charges, a jewelry receipt, midnight calls, and matching lies? Tiffany started crying and said she had been lonely while our mother was sick, and I had been too busy to see that she was in crisis too. Then she said that sometimes people find each other when they're weak, and that doesn't make them as evil as I wanted them to be. I barely had time to process what she had just admitted when my mother made a short, broken sound and grabbed at her chest. Everything after that moved fast. My father jumped up. Aiden rushed to hold her. Tiffany dropped to her knees beside the chair. I stood there frozen with the papers still in my hands. An ambulance was called. My mother was loaded onto a stretcher. And inside all that chaos, nobody looked at me like the woman who had been betrayed. They looked at me like the cause of my mother collapsing. I followed them to the hospital in a state so blank it almost felt unreal. Outside the emergency room, my father finally turned to me after more than an hour. He said I should have thought about my mother's health first. I asked him if what those 2 had done to me somehow mattered less than the fact that I said it out loud. He rubbed his forehead, exhausted, and said he wasn't saying that, but this was not the way. That answer was worse than a direct denial. The next day, the doctors said it wasn't a stroke, but my mother needed to avoid major stress. In less than 24 hours, the entire story had shifted. Instead of talking about what Aiden and Tiffany had done, the family focus turned to protecting a calm environment so my mother could recover. My wedding was postponed. Nobody called it what it was. Nobody said this was fallout from betrayal. I went back to the apartment Aiden and I shared and stared at my wedding dress hanging in the living room because I had just brought it home from the final fitting. It stood there like the most elegant joke of my life. Within a week, the venue cancellation emails were sent. The florist called to ask if I wanted to reschedule. The planner texted with her polished professional sympathy. A few close friends checked in, but even in their questions, I could hear that somewhere, somehow, they had already heard a different version of the story. Aiden moved out of the apartment so quickly it made me realize he had been prepared. He took his things while I was at work and left only a short note saying he thought I needed space and hoped one day we could talk like adults. I read it, crumpled it, and dropped it in the trash. The news that Tiffany was pregnant reached me on a rainy afternoon through a phone call from my Aunt Elaine. I sat on my kitchen floor with my back against the cabinet and listened to each word sink like a stone. The timeline matched perfectly with the weeks I had still been trying on veils. I covered my mouth because I was afraid I would scream. The most painful part wasn't the child itself. That baby was innocent. What crushed me was this. From that moment on, the betrayal was no longer an act that could be denied. It had a heartbeat, a due date, a place waiting for it in my family tree. When I saw my parents after that, my mother cried and said the baby had done nothing wrong. She said family could not turn its back on a child. I understood that. But I also understood something far more painful. They had chosen the path that created the least disruption for their system, and that path had no room for my pain. In just a few weeks, I had gone from the daughter getting married to the problem-threatening family harmony. Then everything was made official with a speed that left me dizzy. Tiffany and Aiden started appearing together in public. There was a photo of them at a charity event, a small party announcing the baby, social media comments about life's unexpected roads. I stared at those posts in a coffee shop one afternoon, saw my sister's hand resting on her stomach, while the man who had once been measured for my wedding ring stood beside her like some devoted future father. I wanted to smash my phone. Instead, I turned the screen face down and sat there until my coffee went cold. The only direct message Tiffany sent me in that period was one of those messages that sounds half like an apology and half like a victory speech. She wrote that life is complicated, that nobody plans for things like this, that sometimes love comes in ways people can't control. The last line was the line that showed her real face. She said she hoped one day I would understand this wasn't about taking what was mine, but about two people who truly belonged together finally finding each other. When I finished reading it, my fingertips were shaking. I stayed in Boston a few more months, trying to cling to work and whatever dignity I still had left. But the city started closing in around me. I got a job offer in Chicago, at first just as a backup plan. Then one November evening, I came home to my freezing apartment and saw the box of wedding invitations still shoved in the kitchen drawer. That was when I understood I had to go. If I stayed, I would keep breathing the same air that had slowly rotted me from the inside. Before I left Boston, I went to the hospital to see my mother alone. She looked much thinner. The skin on her hands had gone so translucent I could see the blue veins under the light. I pulled a chair close to her bed and took her hand. Finally, she looked at me with red eyes and said she knew she had failed to protect me the way she should have. She said she had been too tired, too scared of losing control, too desperate to keep the family from breaking further while illness was swallowing everything. I listened to her with a quiet pain. It didn't fix anything. But it was the first time anyone in my family had looked straight at my wound without calling it an overreaction. I asked my mother whether she thought I was selfish for leaving. She slowly shook her head. Then she said, "Just live, Amanda. Don't let this pain become all of who you are." I bent down, pressed my forehead to the back of her hand, and cried like a child. The next morning, I drove to Logan Airport feeling like I was leaving the scene of a disaster everyone had agreed to call by another name. Boston faded behind the glass. I didn't turn around for one last look. I just kept going. At that point, leaving was the only way I could save any piece of myself. Chicago met me with sharp cold wind and the almost cruel relief of anonymity. I stepped out of the airport with one large suitcase, one heavy tote full of documents, and a heart so torn open it barely had enough strength left to react. The city didn't know who I was. It didn't know I had lost a wedding, that my sister was carrying my ex-fiancé's baby, or that my family had chosen surface peace over truth. And because it didn't know, Chicago became breathable in a strange way. Nobody looked at me with pity. Nobody said Tiffany's name. I was just a woman who had moved to a new city for a new job. For the first time in months, I could breathe. My first apartment in Chicago was much smaller than the one I had in Boston. It was on the 6th floor of an older building near River North, with narrow windows, a tiny kitchen, and a heating system that rattled through the night. I unpacked alone in silence. I hung work shirts in the closet, stacked a few books on a shelf, set my toothbrush beside the sink, then stood in the middle of that nearly empty living room and felt like I was rebuilding my life out of the most basic objects. On my first night, I sat on the floor eating store-bought salad from a plastic box while sirens moved through the street outside, and I realized I had gone a whole day without thinking about my wedding dress or the fake innocence on my sister's face. The new job came at exactly the right time. I joined a brand strategy firm as a senior director, handling clients in image crises or major repositioning moments. In my first week, I got thrown into a chaotic project for a luxury cosmetics brand that had just been hit with backlash over the wrong messaging. I spent my days in meetings, Reading customer behavior data, rebuilding language frameworks, managing PR teams, talking to executives, then getting home around 10 with my brain still running. The work wasn't gentle. It didn't leave room for me to lie in bed and hold my grief all night. Success came faster than I expected. In the first 3 months, I saved a campaign everyone in the company thought was dead. 6 months later, I was given 2 more major clients. A year in, I had become the person people went to when a brand needed a new voice after a scandal. One day, I was standing in front of a glass board in a conference room, explaining how to rebuild a narrative for a major company, and I realized I was making a living helping other people control public perception after damage. The problem with healing through work is that it looks convincing from the outside. My coworkers saw me as sharp, stable, effective. They didn't see the nights I opened the fridge and closed it again because I wasn't hungry. They didn't see me stiffen when a stranger's perfume drifted through an elevator. They didn't see the nights I woke at 3 in the morning from dreams about standing in Aiden's office again. I lived like someone holding up a collapsing wall with my own body. What finally changed my path wasn't a new relationship or some huge career break. It started when I finally agreed to therapy. For almost a year, I resisted the idea. I told myself I was smart, employed, capable, and didn't need to sit in a room with a stranger and retell my life like some victim. But one winter evening, I stood in my bathroom under cold white light and realized I had become a person who no longer knew how to drop her shoulders even when she was safe. I called a clinic HR had recommended, and the next week I sat across from a woman in her 50s named Dr. Elaine Foster. In the first session, I told the whole story like a clean presentation. The broken engagement, my sister's pregnancy, my mother's illness, the move, the new job. I used words like difficulty and transition. Dr. Foster let me finish. Then she looked at me and asked, "Amanda, who taught you that if you name what they did to you, you're the one overreacting?" That question hit the exact place I had been avoiding for a year. It was the first time I cried in therapy, and it wasn't because of Aiden. It was because I realized I had carried my family's voice all the way to Chicago. Over time, therapy gave me something that surface strength never could. I started calling what had happened by its real name. It was betrayal, emotional manipulation, gaslighting, a system of abandonment inside a family more afraid of tension than injustice. Once I named it properly, I stopped seeing myself as a woman who got replaced because she wasn't enough. I started seeing myself as someone who survived a web of lies held up by silence. Around the same time, work led me to Brandon Mitchell. The first time I saw him, he was sitting in a glass conference room at the Langham during a pitch meeting. My firm was presenting on a major repositioning deal that involved a strategic investment group he represented. Brandon wasn't the loudest person in the room. He sat slightly off to one side in a charcoal suit, one hand resting on a leather notebook, focused in a way that created almost total stillness in a room full of ambition. After I finished presenting, he asked the best question in the simplest form. If we change how the public sees this brand without changing how it treats customers, how long does your plan actually hold? After the meeting, one of my coworkers leaned over and whispered that Brandon had a reputation for being quiet, sharp, and not wasting time. I just nodded. But in the weeks after that, once the project moved forward, Brandon started showing up in more meetings. He always arrived on time, remembered what everyone had said the last time, and never used his presence to force the room to orbit around him. That felt so unfamiliar, it made me cautious. We started talking more after meetings, while waiting for elevators or during group lunches. He asked about work in a way that showed he actually cared about the answer. I kept my distance. Back then, my body still reacted like an overwired alarm system. Once, after we wrapped a major phase of the project, Brandon asked if I wanted to get dinner. He said it casually, like a simple invitation between two people who had been working hard. I looked at him, thought for a few beats, then said no and blamed work. He didn't push. He just nodded and said, if I ever felt more comfortable, I could let him know. The fact that he didn't pressure me stayed with me longer than the invitation itself. Meanwhile, news from Boston still slipped into my life now and then. Someone mentioned Aiden at a dinner tied to investment circles in New York. Every so often, I would check Tiffany's social media like a bad habit I couldn't fully quit. She posted pictures of a suburban house, a perfect nursery, dinners that looked like magazine spreads. Aiden stood beside her with his hand at the small of her back, framed just right so he looked devoted. If you looked only at those pictures, you would think I was the loser in a story that had already ended. But the longer it went on, the more cracks showed. Tiffany's photos started looking more forced. The smile was there. The eyes looked tired. Rumors in business circles began to mention that a few of Aiden's investments weren't going the way he had promised. Once, at a client dinner, a man across from me said Aiden's name with a dry, amused tone, like Aiden had stepped into a game that was starting to outrun him. I listened. I didn't ask questions. One night after a late meeting, Brandon and I sat in the quiet hotel bar waiting for the rain outside to let up. That was the first time I told him the truth about my past. I started by saying I had once been engaged. Then I added that it had not ended well. Brandon didn't interrupt. He just sat there, turning his water glass slowly in his hand, giving me enough attention that I didn't feel watched, only heard. When I got to Tiffany, the baby, and my family choosing silence, I braced myself for the kind of reaction other people had given me. Brandon gave me none of them. He said, slowly, "What they did doesn't say anything about your value. It only shows who they are." It was a simple sentence, but it landed in the deepest place inside me. After that night, things between us shifted in a way that wasn't loud but was solid. We had dinner more often. We took walks after work. We talked about things that got more honest each time. Brandon told me about a stretch a few years earlier when his own career had cracked because a business partner betrayed him, and how he had to rebuild not just his work, but his sense of self outside achievement. He didn't tell it like a man trying to rescue me. He told it like someone who believed real pain didn't need polishing to matter. That was what started softening me. I didn't fall in love with him on one dramatic day. I fell in love through small things that built on each other. The way he slowed his pace because he knew I hated feeling rushed. The way he always asked whether I wanted to keep going with a hard conversation or stop there for the night. The way he named his own feelings instead of making me guess. With Aiden, I had once thought safety meant being with a man competent enough to control everything. With Brandon, I learned that real safety is when you can exist fully without shrinking your voice. My work also took on a new shape during those years. I got promoted again. Then I began taking a small equity share in a few strategic advisory deals that brought in more money than I had ever imagined back in Boston. I started investing carefully with people I trusted and realized I wasn't just earning more. I was building something stronger than any need to win against my past. Over time, I truly stopped imagining Tiffany's face when she found out I was doing well. To me, that was the clearest sign that I had moved beyond the wound. Brandon proposed on a Sunday morning in late fall in his kitchen while I was making coffee in an old gray sweater that had gone soft from washing. No luxury restaurant, no music, no public kneeling scene. He set down his mug, looked at me for a long second like he had been thinking about the next words for a long time, and said he didn't want to build me a perfect moment for other people to admire. He wanted to build a life where every morning I woke up and felt peace inside it. Then he pulled the ring box from his pocket. I started crying before I could even laugh. When I said yes, the first feeling wasn't fireworks. It was something deeper and steadier than that. Relief, peace, a kind of calm so strong it almost made me dizzy. We got married in a small ceremony in Chicago with only a few close friends, no relatives from Boston. I wore a simple silk dress and carried white flowers. I walked toward Brandon in a room full of late afternoon light. Nothing about that day looked like the wedding I had once planned as a younger woman, and that was exactly why it was mine. We had dinner with our small circle, laughed a lot, and went home feeling strangely light. That night, as I took my earrings off in front of the mirror, I thought about my mother. I wished she had been healthy enough, brave enough, or simply less afraid to see me then. The years after that moved quickly. Brandon and I built a life with its own rhythm. I stayed distant from Boston. I called my father a few times each year, usually to ask about my mother's health. Those calls were always short. Too much had gone unsaid, and I never knew where to put my hands inside the ruins without kicking up all the dust again. Then one ordinary morning, while I stood in the kitchen checking my meeting schedule on a tablet, my phone rang. My father's name lit up the screen. I answered almost immediately because an old fear still lived in my body somewhere. The sound of his voice told me everything before he finished the sentence. He said my mother had died a little before 4 that morning. I sank to the kitchen floor without even realizing when it happened. The cold tile pressed through my knees. I heard my father keep talking about the hospital, about how quickly it happened in the end, about the funeral being in Boston 3 days later. But the words "Mom died" kept echoing in my head like sound bouncing inside an empty room. I had known this day was coming. Her illness had gone on long enough that none of it was really a surprise. And still, when it finally came, it felt like something had been quietly pulled out of my chest. When I hung up, Brandon was already on the other side of the counter. He didn't rush me with questions. He just sat on the floor beside me, leaned back against the cabinet like I was doing, and stayed there until I could breathe again. I told him what my father had said, then looked down at my own hands and realized they were shaking. Not only because I was scared to return to Boston, though that was part of it. I was scared of walking back into the place where the most broken version of me had been left behind and finding out how much power it still held. Brandon asked what I wanted to do. I leaned my head back against the cabinet, watched the morning light move across the floor, and said I had to go. My mother's funeral wasn't just a ritual. It was a door I could no longer keep walking around if I really wanted to believe I had moved on. Brandon nodded like he had already known that would be my answer. Then he said he was coming with me. I turned and looked at him, and in that moment, I understood that this return would be nothing like the trip I made years ago. Back then, I had left Boston with one suitcase and a body full of fractures. This time, I would be coming back with a life built on truth, the right kind of love, and a strength that no longer needed to raise its voice to prove it existed. I thought Boston would feel smaller after all those years, but the city still knew how to tighten something in my chest the second the plane touched down. The sky was low and gray. Cold wind hit my face when I stepped out of Logan. Brandon walked beside me with one hand on the suitcase handle, calm in a way that was almost silent. He didn't ask if I was okay again. We rode to a hotel in Back Bay without saying much. I watched the old streets and brick facades through the window and realized the strongest feeling wasn't pain. It was like I was watching a movie that had once exhausted me, only now I was no longer trapped inside it. Brandon offered to come with me to the funeral home that same afternoon, but I shook my head. I wanted to go alone first. I wanted to see what version of me still lived in their eyes before they saw the life I had built standing next to me. He only said that if anything felt wrong, I should call and he would come right away. The funeral home was in the suburb where my family had lived for more than 20 years. I drove the rental car through streets I knew so well it hurt. When I parked and stepped out, the air smelled like wet grass, lilies, and old rain. I stood outside for a few seconds, took a breath, adjusted my black coat, and walked in. The first person I saw was my father. He stood near the guest table, shoulders more bent than I remembered, his hair almost fully gray now. When he looked up and saw me, something passed over his face, relief mixed with guilt. He walked forward and hugged me. The hug lasted longer than I expected. I smelled his old shaving cream and damp wool coat, and for 1 second a part of me wanted to collapse into being just a daughter again. But that feeling lasted only a moment. He stepped back and said I looked well. I told him he looked tired. He gave a small, tired smile. We stood there in the front room of the funeral home, two people bound by grief but no longer fluent in each other. I asked how things had been at the end. He gave me small details about the hospital and about how empty the house felt when he came home alone. He led me into the private viewing room. My mother lay there in a half-open casket, her face lightly done so she looked almost asleep. I slowed down. Every sound around me dropped. In my head, Images began flashing out of order. My mother tying my hair when I was little. My mother sitting at the kitchen table reading wedding menus. My mother holding my hand in the hospital telling me to go live my life. I stood beside her for a long time without saying anything. I had thought that when this moment came, I would have some final sentence ready. Instead, I only touched the edge of the wood, watched my hand shake, and whispered that I had come home. When I stepped back into the main hall, I heard a child laughing. I turned and saw Tiffany. She was crouched down, straightening the collar of a little girl about 5 years old, with brown blonde hair neatly tied back. The child looked up just as I glanced over. She had Aiden's eyes. That truth hit me so fast I had to blink hard to keep my face still. Tiffany stood up. She was still beautiful, still carefully maintained, but there were faint shadows under her eyes that makeup couldn't fully hide. Her jaw was tense. Her fingers kept touching her wedding ring, like a habit she didn't know she had. And the strangest thing was the way she looked at me. Not with pity, not exactly with triumph, more like someone checking the temperature of the room. "Amanda," she said, her voice softer than I remembered. "You came." I nodded. I looked at the little girl. Tiffany said her name was Chloe. The girl said hello to me politely, then tucked herself closer to her mother's leg. I crouched slightly, smiled at her, asked if she was tired. She shook her head. I complimented the little star hair clip in her hair. She smiled. That tiny moment made something ache inside me. Tiffany sent Chloe to sit with our aunt in the front row, then turned back to me. She started with the usual funeral words. Mom went peacefully. The last few months had been hard. Dad was barely holding it together. I answered very little, keeping my voice even, and the longer she spoke, the more certain I became that she had rehearsed several possible approaches ahead of time. Aiden appeared a few minutes later. I knew before I saw him. My body recognized his footsteps faster than my mind did. When I turned, he was walking through the front doors in a black coat cut neatly at the shoulders, hair trimmed and styled, one hand holding his phone while the other hovered behind Chloe's back in that model-perfect father gesture. In 5 years, my memory of Aiden had faded in many ways. This time, I wasn't seeing him through the fog of love. I was seeing him the way you see a room that once made it hard to breathe. He stopped in front of me with a face under perfect control. He offered condolences, asked whether my flight had been okay, said my mother had talked about me often in her final months. Every sentence was proper. I listened, and what surprised me was that my heart did not race. I felt only a very clean distance between my present self and the woman I had been when I loved him. We stood side by side for a few short minutes in a corner hallway. Aiden asked where I lived now. I said Chicago. He nodded and said he had heard from my father that I was doing well. I replied that life keeps moving. The sentence sounded simple, but it made him pause just enough that I saw it. He wasn't asking because he cared. He wanted to know how far I had gone, how fully I had forgotten him, how far outside the reach of the old story I had moved. As more guests arrived, I stepped back to observe. Tiffany moved around like the reluctant hostess of family grief, checking flowers, chair placement, drinks, tissues, and how people were looking at her. Aiden kept playing the role of dependable man, shaking hands, hugging older relatives, making small talk, but every so often I saw him glance down at his phone with his jaw tightening. Once, he stepped outside to take a call. When he came back in, his face looked harder. Those details wouldn't have meant anything to anyone else. To me, they were familiar. I knew the face of a man forcing his image to stay intact while the inside of his life was slipping. I could also see that Tiffany almost glowed too brightly anytime anyone mentioned her family life. She talked about Chloe's private school, a recent Nantucket trip, the stress of raising a child and keeping up with charity events, all in a voice that sounded like someone pinning flowers over cracks in a wall. I hadn't told anyone in my family about Brandon yet. He was still at the hotel, giving me a few hours alone before the formal service the next day. The longer I stood there, the more I realized that keeping him temporarily outside the frame had its own effect. Tiffany assumed I had come alone. Aiden assumed the same. In their minds, I was still Amanda from the old days, just a little less fragile because time had passed. Late that afternoon, when the crowd had thinned, Aiden approached while I was standing near the shelf of memorial candles. He asked if we could talk privately for a minute. I glanced toward my father sitting with relatives, toward Tiffany speaking softly to Chloe, then nodded. We moved into a side hallway near the floral prep room. Aiden started with a sentence that almost sounded sincere. He said time had gone by fast. I answered that for some people it does, for others it doesn't. Then he said he knew tomorrow would be difficult for everyone and that he hoped we could keep things smooth for my father's sake. I nearly laughed. The man who had helped my own sister strip my life apart was now standing in front of me, speaking on behalf of stability and grace. I asked how business was. The question was soft, but I saw the reaction instantly. His shoulders tightened just a little. He said the market was always unpredictable, but overall he was doing fine. I nodded like I believed him. Between my clients in Chicago and the investors I now knew, I had heard enough to know that the word fine was holding more damage than he wanted to admit. Then he asked whether work in Chicago was going well for me. I told him it was busy but worth it. He said he was glad. As we walked back into the main hall, I caught the end of a conversation between Tiffany and one of my father's relatives. She was laughing and saying, half joking, that life now was just school fees, house costs, and endless responsibilities, but luckily, Aiden always knew how to handle things. Right then, Aiden's phone buzzed again. He looked down, his face darkened for a split second. Then he turned the screen over. Tiffany saw it. For less than a second, her smile bent. Then it was back. But for someone who had lived inside tension for years, that change was louder than words. That night, I went back to the hotel after staying until the funeral home closed. Brandon opened the room door. A cup of hot tea was waiting on the table. I sat on the edge of the bed, slipped off my shoes, and told him about the day piece by piece, how old my father looked, how peaceful my mother seemed, how beautiful but tired Tiffany looked, how Aiden still wore the same carefully measured voice, and all the tiny fractures I could already see in the marriage they had built from my wreckage. Brandon listened closely. When I was done, he asked what had hurt the most. I said it wasn't seeing Aiden. It wasn't even seeing Tiffany. It was seeing Chloe, because the child made the whole thing both concrete and innocent at once. After a quiet moment, I added that I still hadn't told my family who I had married. Brandon said he would follow my lead the next day. If I wanted him to stay behind me as quiet support, he would do that. If I wanted him to walk in beside me, he would do that too. The next morning, I wore a long-sleeved black dress, tied my hair low, and put on the pearl earrings my mother had once given me. Brandon asked if I was ready. I told him I didn't think anybody was ever really ready for things like this, but I was going anyway. Still, when we got to the funeral home, I let him stay back for a few minutes. I wanted to walk in first. I wanted to see how Tiffany and Aiden would behave when they believed I had come alone, still the woman they had left behind with a box of invitations and some cheap explanations. Inside, the main room was more crowded than the day before. Quiet voices, shifting chairs, the smell of white flowers, soft organ music, everything blended into the unique pressure of a family funeral. Tiffany came toward me almost immediately. She lightly touched my arm and guided me toward a corner near the framed photo of my mother. Her makeup was flawless, but her eyes looked more hollow than the day before. She looked me up and down like she was trying to assess what kind of woman I had become over the last 5 years. Then she smiled, a thin, beautiful smile that an outsider might mistake for kindness. "You look better than I expected," she said. I thanked her. Tiffany tilted her head and lowered her voice so only I could hear. She said time really does heal a lot, and she had always hoped that one day I would truly be at peace with the past, because in the end, everybody has to accept what life chooses for them. I looked her right in the eyes while she said it. Beneath the soft words, I could still hear the old blade. She wasn't trying to comfort me. She was trying to find out whether I had accepted the place she had forced me into. I was just about to answer when the large doors behind us opened. Something changed in the air. The kind of shift that happens when someone enters and, without saying a word, still draws a few glances. I looked up and saw Brandon walking in, his black coat sharp, his posture steady, his eyes finding me through the room. In that moment, I could feel Tiffany's hand still resting on my arm. I could also feel her body go slightly rigid, like some instinct in her had already sensed that the script was about to slip. The second she followed my line of sight, I knew the old board was finally about to flip. Brandon entered the funeral hall with a calm that made everything around me seem to slow down. He wasn't trying to pull focus. He just walked straight toward me, one hand holding his coat, his expression steady and warm. Tiffany's hand was still on my arm. Her fingers tightened before she let go. When she fully turned to look at Brandon, the first thing that broke across her face wasn't curiosity. It was confusion. Brandon stopped beside me and lightly touched the small of my back. I looked at Tiffany and said, in the most normal voice I could manage, "Tiffany, have you met my husband?" For me, that sentence wasn't revenge. It was the first line I had drawn for myself in years. Tiffany blinked. For a few seconds, she said nothing. She looked at Brandon, then at me. I introduced him simply. I said his name, said we had been married for a while, then turned toward Aiden. His face barely changed, but his eyes did. He knew exactly who Brandon was. Brandon Mitchell, the kind of man whose voice carried weight in the kind of deals Aiden had always wanted to enter. Aiden walked over and held out his hand with the forced politeness of a man who knew too many people were watching. Brandon shook it, calm, brief, respectful. I stood between them and realized something very simple. Back when I was with Aiden, I thought power was something that had to be made visible. But now the most grounded man in the room was the one who didn't need to prove anything. That contrast was what made Aiden look smaller. Tiffany recovered faster than I expected. She smiled and said how surprising this was, that she had no idea I was married. Her voice stayed soft, but her breathing had shifted. I said things had been private, and life in Chicago had become busy enough that I no longer felt the need to update everyone on every detail of my life. The memorial service started shortly after that. I sat beside Brandon in the front row. My father sat between us and Tiffany's side of the family. Tiffany sat with Chloe. Aiden sat at the far end. Throughout the service, I tried to keep my mind on my mother. I listened to the stories people told about her. I saw Chloe lean against Tiffany's shoulder, and once, a quiet wave of sadness passed through me. Every adult in this story had done too much damage. That child had done none. When the service ended, guests began moving into the reception room behind the main hall. A few old family friends recognized Brandon's name and pulled him into conversation. I stepped into a side hallway near the family room to breathe for a minute. I had just placed my hand on the windowsill when I heard a familiar click of heels behind me. Tiffany stood at the far end of the hallway. The perfect smile was gone. She stared at me for a moment, then asked in a voice that almost burst out of her, "Why didn't you tell anyone you married Brandon Mitchell?" I turned to look at her. That question confirmed everything more clearly than any confession could have. She didn't ask if I was happy. She wanted to know why I had moved so far outside her control that she no longer even had information about my life. I told her my life was no longer a family press release. Tiffany gave a short, dry laugh, but it broke before it finished. She leaned against the wall and crossed her arms as if holding herself together. Under the bright white hallway lights, I could see her more clearly than at any point all day. The makeup still looked beautiful. Her hair was still perfect, but around her eyes was pure exhaustion. She said she had always assumed I would hate her forever. I told her there were times I thought I would never stop being angry. But staying angry forever is just another kind of chain, and I wasn't interested in carrying it anymore. Tiffany swallowed and looked away. When she spoke again, her voice was very low. "You don't know, Amanda. He's hell." I didn't ask who she meant. I already knew. She started speaking in fragments. Aiden controlled money more than people realized. He exploded when deals went bad, then smiled perfectly in public. She had seen messages from other women. The life she kept posting about wasn't anything like the photos. It was full of tension, anger, financial instability, and the constant pressure of keeping the glossy finish intact because she had sacrificed too much to admit she had chosen wrong. I listened to her and felt none of the victory I used to imagine in my darkest years. What I felt instead was a very human emptiness. Tiffany had done the cruelest thing possible to me. But the woman standing in front of me now wasn't the glowing version of my sister who always needed to win. She was a woman who had tied her whole life to the wrong kind of victory. I looked at her and said, "You didn't steal my life, Tiffany. You just took something that was never really yours." Tiffany closed her eyes for one short beat. When she opened them again, they were redder. She didn't ask me to forgive her. I didn't promise anything. Some things, once broken, can't be restored. You can only learn to accept the new shape of them. I walked past her and returned to the main hall. When I stepped back in, Brandon was standing beside my father and Chloe. He had crouched down to the little girl's level and was showing her how to fold a tissue into a bunny shape. Chloe laughed. Brandon looked up and met my eyes, quietly asking if I was okay. I nodded. We left the funeral home in the late afternoon. The wind had turned colder and carried the smell of wet leaves. I held Brandon's hand on the way to the car, not because I was about to fall apart, but because for the first time since my father called to tell me my mother had died, I felt an old chapter inside me closing for real. I was not leaving Boston as the defeated woman. I was not leaving as someone who had just gotten revenge either. I was leaving as a woman who had moved beyond humiliation, beyond rage, and beyond the need to be acknowledged by the people who once hurt her most. That night in the hotel room, I sat by the window looking at the city lights and thought about my mother. I thought maybe she would understand what I had finally learned. Real happiness is not about coming back to prove you are better than someone else. It's about no longer needing to win by the old definition at all.
Hi everyone, I'm Sophia. If you stayed with Amanda all the way to the end, then you already understand this wasn't just a cheating story. This was a story about betrayal at the deepest level, when the people who hurt you most are your own family and the person you trusted most. Amanda didn't only lose her fiancé, she lost her sense of safety inside her own family. What made Amanda strong wasn't that she never fell apart. She absolutely did. She lost her wedding, lost her family, and even lost the innocent version of herself. But her strength came from refusing to let that tragedy become her whole identity. She walked away, rebuilt her life, healed, built a career, and learned how to love again without betraying herself in the process. And Tiffany is the kind of character that makes you feel both anger and sadness. Because deep down, what she probably wanted was never really Aiden. What she wanted was the feeling of beating Amanda. But if you build your whole life around needing to be above someone else, then even when you win, you still end up empty. And Aiden is the kind of man who is genuinely dangerous in real life, polite on the surface, successful, always saying the right thing. But underneath it all is a huge ego and a constant need to be served. Men like that don't really love anyone. And when they walk into a family that already has cracks in it, they don't just betray one relationship, they use the fracture that was already there. If there's one lesson I hope people take from this story, it's this. Your instincts deserve respect. Your pain does not need other people's approval to be real. And sometimes losing a person, a relationship, or even the old version of your family is exactly what opens the door to a life that fits you better. Living well after betrayal is not pretending to be strong. It's healing for real. And maybe that's why this story stays with you. Because it reminds us that the biggest price a betrayer pays isn't always the moment they get exposed. Sometimes it's having to live the rest of their life inside the choice they made. Now I really want to hear from you. If you were Amanda, would you forgive Tiffany? Do you think she did the right thing by leaving, or should she have confronted everything even earlier? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story made you think, please hit like to support the channel. If you enjoy family drama stories with big twists but real emotion, don't forget to subscribe to Family Drama True Story and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next video. I'm Sophia. Thank you for staying with me to the end of this story. I'll see you in the next one.